It's him. It's him. It's him with the crap records.
Oh, look, it's John with the crap records. Oh, it's John with the crap records. Oh, 200 crap records.
My top 200 crap records. Oh, 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 oh. 200 crap records. He's got 200 crap records.
200. He's got more than that. They're just 200 of his top pick.
My goodness, 200 crap records.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. He's got Pearl Jam in there.
Digital gramophone makes no sense.
At 140, I have Slanted and Enchanted by Pavement from 1992. There's a compilation that I came across as a 14, 15-year-old called No Alternative. Some of you are probably familiar with it. And that compilation was responsible for introducing me to two bands that I absolutely love to this day. One being Uncle Tupelo, and the other one being Pavement. Pavement had a song called The Unseen Power of the Picket Fence, which was kind of a tribute to REM. And I'll admit, at the time, I wasn't absolutely bowled over by that song. I wasn't really in love with it, and it didn't really send me out to get Pavement albums like right away. Of course, a couple years later, Cut Your Hair was kind of a regularly played video on MTV's 120 Minutes. And I really liked that song, and I did pick up Crooked Rain, Crooked Rain. But it kind of got buried underneath all of the more kind of typical, more radio-friendly alternative music that I was listening to at that time in my life. Fast forward a few more years into the late 90s, and I got my hands on a compilation from Matador Records. I believe it was called What's Up, Matador? There was a Pavement song on there that got me a little bit more interested. And so I went and I picked up this album. Pavement was a nice change of course for me, and really kind of exposed me to a type of music that I had largely ignored up to this point. Pavement was definitely a ground changer, and they kind of laid the groundwork for the indie bands that I would really get into over the next several years, all the way to, you know, where I am now, pretty much, and you know, my musical taste. The coolest thing about Pavement was Stephen Malkmus, and I'm a huge Stephen Malkmus fan. With Malkmus, he kind of has the same thing that Jonathan Richman has. You know, it's his delivery, his vocal delivery, his cadence, the way he sings the words. The words are brilliant too, but it's the way he sings those words, or I guess rather sings those words. And then yeah, of course, there's the whole like Slacker thing, the Slacker label they would take on. But I honestly feel like with this album, it's the lo-fi recording quality of it that kind of hides that that Slacker playing, that Slacker style. That would actually get more prominent and stick out a lot more once the production level and the studio equipment got better, you know, over their ensuing albums. At 139, I have Micro Castle by Deer Hunter from 2008. Deer Hunter was a band that I'd been reading about for, you know, a few years. They were critically lauded, but a band that I really didn't dive into until this album, which came out in 2008. And it wouldn't be until a couple of years later with Halcyon Digest that I really became a fan. And I went back and just started consuming more and more Deer Hunter, and I'm a pretty big fan now. Deer Hunter is kind of like that type A critical darling. You know, they have all these elements, they pull from different elements of rock and roll history, you know, and combine all of those things that they kind of check off a lot of boxes with, you know, of cool factor. You know, the obscure psychedelic rock, these extended jams that kind of remind you of maybe like krautrock and things like that, elements of shoegazy guitars and, you know, noise that would be inspired by the Velvet Underground or Sonic Youth. But it's how they wrap all those elements up, you know, and all of those components and piece them together to make their own sound. And they have an incredibly unique sound. Nobody else sounds like Deer Hunter. Bradford Cox also has a very unique perspective. He has Marvin syndrome, and it's caused him to feel and experience a lot of alienation just because of how it affects his appearance. It's also affected his sexuality, and he's always kind of like described himself as an asexual person in ways, even though I believe he identifies as gay. It's that alienation and that mystery that makes this music so intriguing, you know, aside from all of the different sounds that really kind of resonate with certain fans of this type of music. Microcastle in particular is an album that's full of peaks and valleys. You know, there are these loud moments filled with noise and these energetic extended jams, but then there's also a lot of really quiet moments that pull from kind of like bedroom dream pop.
I had dreams that tried to me awake. I happened to escape, but my escape would never come, would never come, would never come, would never come. I had plans to go away for days, to try and escape pains that haunts my days, that haunts my days, haunts my days, haunts my days, haunt my days.
Oh. 138, I have The Blueprint by Jay-Z from 2001. I'll be honest, throughout the 90s, I wasn't really into any hip-hop that was getting radio play. The more popular stuff, the stuff that you would see on MTV like all the time. I wasn't into Bad Boy, I wasn't into, you know, Puff Daddy, I wasn't really into the West Coast sound, Tupac and Dre, and, you know, the stuff that really kind of got me excited about hip-hop were bands like The Roots and Outkast and some of the more kind of like underground stuff. Eventually I would come around to Tupac and Biggie and Nas and a lot of those other guys. And Jay-Z was kind of like my gateway to that. He was an artist that I totally ignored and was just what I thought not my cup of tea. And then I heard this album. And right around the same time, I heard Reasonable Doubt for the first time as well. Reasonable Doubt was what showed me how fantastic of a lyricist Jay-Z was. And that incredible lyricism also exists on this album. But it's the production by Kanye West and Just Blaze that makes all of these songs so accessible, yet have so much depth, in the samples that they choose. I was blown away at the use of 5 to 1 by the Doors on The Takeover. I just never heard rock music and rock music from that era used in such a clever way. The other thing that's absolutely fantastic on this album is the song Renegade and Eminem's guest spot. The best guest spots in the history of hip hop are the best moments on that album. And Eminem stole the show on that particular song. And I actually give Jay-Z a lot of credit for that, In an ego-driven genre, it says a lot about him that he was willing to let M have that moment on this album. 137, Journey in Satchidananda by Alice Coltrane. So this being my next entry from the Jazz 101 catalog. This is an album that I actually heard for the first time in the late 90s when I was kind of getting into my first foray into jazz like all at one time. Like a typical 19, 20-year-old, I came across some list that told me, what the greatest jazz albums of all time were, and this was up there. So I decided to check it out. I don't know what I read about in that blurb that appealed to me, but when I heard it for the first time, my ears and my audio vocabulary up to that point were not quite ready for something like this. It was miles away from Kind of Blue. Yes, this is a jazz album, and yes, I love the jazz elements of it. But what I love the most about it are the things that aren't typical jazz, the classical flourishes that run throughout it, the African and Eastern influences, the drone that's kind of created by the oud and the tambura. It's all the non-jazz elements of this album that has actually caused me to recommend it to people that don't like jazz. I'm not exactly a believer, but that doesn't mean that I don't recognize the spirituality in this music. And I don't have to theologically see the light to feel its grace. At 136, I have Just As I Am by Bill Withers from 1971. My mom was a big Bill Withers fan. I still have her copy of Still Bill. What I love the most about Bill Withers is how he kind of occupies so many different camps. He can write a hit song like Ain't No Sunshine, but he can also appeal to fans of 70s singer-songwriters just as much as he can appeal to fans of soul music. No song in his catalog represents that better than the song Grandma's Hands. Absolutely masterful lyric writing. The way he uses Grandma's hands as a metaphor for the cornerstone of family, a metaphor for nostalgia, a metaphor for wisdom, life advice. My father's father died when he was a teenager. My father's mother died when I was 2. So I really only grew up with one set of grandparents on my mother's side. Both my grandfather and grandmother meant the world to me. My grandmother especially. And when she died in the early 2000s, it was Grandma's Hands that I leaned on heavily to get through that time. It just goes to show the power of song. And even though Bill Withers and I had drastically different life experiences, I could still relate to that song in a very deeply personal way. Just on the strength of that song alone, this album means that much to me and why it's one that I will never let go. At 135, I have Forever Changes by Love, an album at one time considered an overlooked classic. It's actually pretty widely known now and definitely well respected amongst the biggest of music fans. I've always kind of had a problem with this album being pigeonholed as like this psychedelic classic, especially because a lot of Arthur Lee's songwriting on this album is a rejection of the flower power culture that was going on at the time. There's a lot more depth to these songs than just that, than just drug-induced creativity. There's a darkness and a melancholy to a lot of these songs. It's a direct reaction to kind of what was going on in LA at the time, or what had gone on in the previous years leading up to this point. It's another one of those albums that was being created at a time when the band, at least this iteration of the lineup, was like falling apart. It's kind of a good example of where a producer and the record company could step in and kind of rescue it in some ways. I mean, Arthur Lee's input was always there. It's not like he was being directed and told exactly what to do, but bringing in the Wrecking Crew and bringing in the horns and the brass on this album really takes it to another level that a lot of other psychedelic, albums at the time didn't really go to. At 134, I have Sail Away by Randy Newman from 1972. And this one is all about the songwriting. It's a bit about the performance too, and Randy Newman is just an incredibly unique personality. His bluesy, jazzy, kind of soulful vocals are really strong, and his piano playing is fantastic on this album. But yeah, it's really about the songwriting. My favorite thing about Randy Newman, and really what should be most people's favorite thing about Randy Newman, is his wit. His very wry, dry wit. But it also contributes to some biting commentary. I mean, the sarcasm is rich in the song Sail Away, but the topic at hand is a deep one that scars this nation to this day. And then, of course, there's political science, which is just as relevant today as it was, 50 years ago. The real opus on this album, in my opinion, is God's Song, That's Why I Love Mankind, which is just so far ahead of its time as an absolutely blazing condemnation of religion as a whole. It's the perfect example of how he can take irony and use it to kind of get his point across.
Christians and the Jews were having a jamboree. The Buddhists and the Hindus joined on satellite TV. They picked their 4 greatest priests, and they began to speak. They said, Lord, a plague is on the world. Lord, no man is free. Temples that we built to you fallen into the sea. Lord, if you won't take care of us, won't you please, please let us be? And the Lord said, I burn down your cities. How blind you must be. I take from you your children and you say, how blessed are we. Man, you really must be crazy to put your faith in me. That's why I love mankind. You really need me. That's why I love mankind.
At 133, I have Park Life by Blur from 1994. I didn't experience Britpop in the 90s. It just went right past me. And maybe as an American, I'm not alone in that. At least as being an American teenager at the time, I probably wasn't alone in that. I did have friends that were big Oasis fans. I didn't really get that at the time. It was very easy for me to just kind of like be a naysayer about Oasis and just be like, well, they just sound like the Beatles. I like Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory a lot more now than I did back then. I also picked up the odd album here or there, like Laid by James or Elastica's first album. But no, I didn't experience Britpop as like a scene, And So I didn't know Blur. I didn't really, I mean, I was aware of them. I was aware of their Girls and Boys as a single, you know, things like that. And then later on in the 90s, you know, Song 2 and Tender. But it was really like 5 or 6 years later when I really decided to fully give Blur a chance. Being a Radiohead fan, another band that really wasn't Britpop, there were all these other bands that were kind of coming out in the late 90s, early 2000s that were being billed kind of as like Radiohead copycats. Coldplay, obviously. Star Sailor kind of comes to mind. I guess Doves. And really, Park Life by Blur was the perfect place for me to go at that point, because it was so not that sound. It was so not Radiohead. You know, the elements of glam and kind of the brighter post-punk influence on this album. It's kind of funny because there are a couple of albums that I've already talked about up to this point, and I feel have a certain kinship with this album, and maybe even another one that is coming up down the line. But it's, you know, All Mod Cons by The Jam, English Settlement by XTC, and Park Life by Blur are all albums that sound very British, even by British standards. And I think it's just because of so much of the material on it is direct commentary on just British life as a whole. Something obviously that I don't have any experience in, but I just find that very interesting, that thread that runs through those albums. Maybe there's like a buried Anglophile in me somewhere that I just haven't fully tapped into yet. So 132, Animals by Pink Floyd from 1977. For many, many years, from teens into like my early college years, all the Floyd I had experienced was solely in 3 albums: Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall. And for some reason, I distinctly remember this moment in time when I was in a photography class in college, and you're standing around kind of waiting for your photos to go through all the chemicals to eventually hang in the darkroom. There's a lot of time to kind of like talk, you know? And there was a conversation going on, and it was revolving around Pink Floyd. And people were kind of going around the room and like naming their favorite like Pink Floyd album. And there was only one guy that said, my favorite Pink Floyd album is unequivocally Animals. It was just that moment. That's all it took. And I was like, well, fuck, I gotta hear Animals. And it's an album that I enjoyed at the time. I was into a lot of music that was kind of like based around a lot of extended, long, kind of like jammy things. I don't need to get into the details of all of that. It's an album that has grown with me over time. It continues to grow with me. There are days when I think it is my favorite Pink Floyd album. Yet, it's not. But what I really find the most fascinating about this album is the context surrounding like when it came out. In 1977 is the punk explosion. And all these bands, pretty much led by the Sex Pistols, or at least them making the most noise, you know, with all of this scathing criticism of the UK system, you know, the English system, the establishment. And yet, here's this band that's been around for years and probably considered a bunch of old farts by all those punks, and they put out the album that is probably the harshest and has the most scathing like criticism of like the establishment at that point. 131, Sister by Sonic Youth from 1987. This album kind of completes an equation that I've worked up over the years in my head of 3 albums separated 10 years apart, beginning 20 years before this album came out, with The Velvet Underground and Nico from 1967, and the noise and kind of chaotic sound of some of the songs on that album, combined with Marquee Moon Television's album from 1977 and the guitar interplay between Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd. And you get this, Sister by Sonic Youth. It's a transitional album, I feel, between their earlier work and what would eventually become their signature sound that they would just kind of tweak and evolve over time, you know, starting with Daydream Nation. It has elements of what would become their signature sound, you know, Lee Ronaldo and Thurston Moore's like guitar interplay, and combined with like Kim Gordon's very distinct narrative vocal style that would become a huge cornerstone of their sound for the next several years. It's the one example on this list where it's my favorite album by a band and it's not their most accessible. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with liking, you know, the more accessible works by bands that I love over time. But it's the sheer raw noise and the chaotic feel that runs throughout this album, the loose structure of the songs. That's why it's my favorite Sonic Youth album.
Today's final Rock and Roll Jeopardy category is biographies. Players, here's your clue. The London Times review of a biography of this man was headlined, "Knight in Tight Satin." You have 30 seconds. Good luck.